Welcome to episode 23 of the Cycling Europe podcast, and welcome to Rydal Hall, just to the north of Ambleside in the English Lake District. My name is Andrew P. Sykes. Now, I'd like to say that these podcasts are made as part of some well thought out master plan. Alas, they aren't. Sorry to disappoint if master plans are your thing. They tend to be a bit more ad hoc, me coming up with an idea and going with it. Or rather, as is often the case, fellow cyclists contacting me with an interesting cycle touring tale and me planning a podcast around that. This has certainly been the case for episode 23 of the podcast. A few weeks ago I was contacted independently by two cyclists who had embarked on very different cycle tours of Europe. But they did have one thing in common, which was that the inspiration behind their trips was more than just a desire to cycle from place A to place B and have fun along the way. One concerned a world record, the other a lyric from an iconic song. We'll hear from both of those cyclists, David Heywood and James Briggs, in a few minutes, but their stories prompted me to sort out some summer cycle touring of my own. Those of you who are regular visitors to cyclingeurope.org will know that, for fairly obvious reasons, my planned end-to-end journey along the length of Japan had to be abandoned for 2020 at least. Those of you who are regular listeners to the podcast may also remember episode 21, which was all about the early 20th century epic European cycling tour of Maximilian J. St. George. He, perhaps inadvertently, ended up visiting most of the European capital cities of his day, and at the end of the podcast I did leave hanging the thought of doing something similar in the early 21st century. Not all at once, I hasten to add, but if I were to embark upon a similar quest myself, the logical capital to start with would be the last on Maximilian's list, Edinburgh. Cycling from my home in Pennine, West Yorkshire to the Scottish capital might not break any records or be inspired by a song lyric, but following in the tyre tracks of Maximilian J. St. George, albeit in reverse, is as good an inspiration as any other, and would allow me to take in some of the most spectacular cycle touring scenery of the UK. Now, today is Saturday the 18th of July, although you wouldn't necessarily think so from the weather here in the Lake District, and earlier this week I set off. After cycling a fairly familiar journey to Bolton Abbey in North Yorkshire, I camped overnight at the excellent Catskill campsite, where I'd arranged to meet the cycling writer Rob Ainsley, as I knew he'd embarked on numerous cycle trips over the years which had been inspired by a whole range of different things, from points of the compass to rivers, twin towns and even words that rhyme. I also knew that he'd have something interesting to say about the rides of David Heywood and James Briggs, so after a day spent cycling together from Bolton Abbey, along the wharf to Kettlewell, and then over the hills to a small campsite at Hardrow, we headed off to a busy pub in nearby Hawes for a chat. I'll be back at the end of the podcast to fill you in on the rest of my trip so far, but here's Rob kicking things off in the pub by introducing himself.
I'm Rob Ainsley. I'm a cycling writer. I do quite a bit more cycling than writing about it, but I've written a couple of cycling books, one of which is Bluffy Cycling, and I write a bit for Cycling Plus, among other magazines. For Cycling Plus I do some research, some routes for articles in their magazine, and I have a monthly column.
Apart from the writing and the cycling, which we have in common, we also, I discovered today, we both have degrees in mathematics from some of the finest institutions in the country. I have a degree in maths from York University, and you have a degree in maths from some university down south?
Oxford, a little sort of provincial town down south, yeah.
Yeah, I think I've heard of it. Right. We're talking in this podcast about interesting premises for cycle tours, and we're going to be listening to two people, David Heywood and James Briggs, who I interviewed last week, and they both came up with a really interesting idea for coming up with their own cycle tour. But you are a prolific cycle tourist, far more than me. I mean, I've been doing it for 10 years, you've been doing it for, I think, a lot longer than that. And also within Yorkshire, you've come up with some really interesting ideas for rides that you've done over the last X number of years. So can you just very briefly talk about the rides that you've done and how you've themed them, how you've come up with the ideas, the routes that you've followed?
One of the ones I enjoyed most was a series of rides I did a couple of years ago from my house in York, which is pretty much in the centre of historic Yorkshire. And I just had this idea of cycling along the compass directions from my house until I got to the furthest north, the furthest west, the furthest southeast and so on, that you could ride in Yorkshire to the historic border. And there was that element of the arbitrary about it, a bit like James's trip, which always seems to work in the context of a cycle tour. You can start off with something completely arbitrary, but you end up having a really interesting experience and a unique experience. So that series of rides really worked. Another one, a series that I'm doing at the moment, is following Yorkshire's main rivers, so the Swale, the Wharfe, the Nid and so on, down the Dales from the mouth of the river to the source. And again, that's a really interesting challenge in terms of the route, because you can't always follow the river exactly. Do you go on a mountain bike? Do you go on a trekking bike? Do you go on a road bike? How do you go along bridleways and so on? And I'm really enjoying that series too.
And you've also done quite a few point-to-point. I mean, I suppose the ones that I've done tend to be come up with a reason to go from point A to point B, whether it be the southernmost point of Europe or to the northernmost point, or whether it be from the second long ride, which was from kind of the southeastern point of Europe to the southwestern point of Europe, or the first one, my home in Reading, down to a friend's home in southern Italy. So mine have been point to point, and you've done quite a few, I think, continental point to points or country point to points as well.
Yes, I did an end-to-end in Britain, Land's End John O'Groats in 1997, and really enjoyed that. And in the last few years I've been trying to collect as many international end-to-ends as I can. So I've done, for example, Sri Lanka, from the southernmost point to the northernmost point of Sri Lanka, Cuba from the easternmost to the westernmost point, Taiwan from north to south, the Faroes, that didn't take long, the Isle of Man, that didn't take long either. And again, it's this really interesting challenge of finding a route and seeing the whole country.
I'll explain that we're sitting in a pub in Hawes, and we've just actually cycled from a campsite near Bolton Abbey where we met last night, and tonight we're staying in another campsite near Hawes, and we spent the day cycling between the two. Quite a spectacular ride, despite the weather, which isn't brilliant, but we've climbed. In fact, can you just give a quick summary of where we've cycled today, because you know it far better than I do?
Yes, we started at Bolton Abbey on the Wharfe, the River Wharfe, which I've cycled as part of my river rides, and we headed north up Wharfedale, and it gets progressively more and more spectacular. So we went through places like Grassington, Kettlewell, Buckden, and then carried on through up to Outer Shore, which is where the wharf starts, and we then went up and over Fleet Moss, which is quite a famous cyclist's climb, up to about 590 metres, and luckily the cloud wasn't too low, so we got some pretty good views from the top. A little bit drizzly, but a fabulous ride, and then a hurtle down into Hawes where we are now.
And what I was going to say is that that's the reason why there's background noise, because we're sitting in a pub. What was the name of the pub? It's called the Board Inn. I think that refers to a chessboard by the looks of the sign, rather than because we're bored rigid. Right, now the first thing we're going to do is listen to an interview I did last week with a chap called David Heywood. Now, he came up with an idea of breaking a world record, and the first thing I asked him was just to describe what his background was in cycling.
Hi, I'm 25, just turned 25, studying medicine up in Belfast. Done a few cycle tours over the year, and now kind of more doing triathlon-based stuff and a few more local trips. But I didn't really have a background in it. It got to 2011, I believe. I was 16, and my older brother had bought a road bike to do an Ironman triathlon, which he'd done kind of on a whim, really. And it looked pretty cool, and with my paper round money, I went and bought my own road bike. And then in the October half term, in my first year of college, so doing my AS levels, we decided to ride to Paris on a whim, really. And we borrowed some kit from friends and planned it in a couple of days, and just kind of booked a ferry for the weekend, and then jumped on our bikes and rode over there. And for me, it was such a mind-blowing experience to be able to cycle all the way to Paris. It's only 300 miles from where we kind of live in London. But it was amazing as a psychology and a mindset change to really kind of recognize that, oh, these places aren't as far away as you think. And it's quite amazing that you can actually go to these places, and it doesn't require incredible amounts of money or whatever, or kind of all the planning to do the flights. It can be done fairly easily. This was such a kind of a revelation for me that a couple of years later, when I must have been 19 and my little brother was 17, I wanted to share that experience with him. And so took him down to Rome. So we did a 3-week trip from London to Rome, largely following kind of Eurovelo 5, which is where I came across a lot of your work on your website about the different Eurovelos. And that was really useful to do that trip. And just the two of us being both kind of young adults, doing it ourselves without the kind of watchful eye of our parents, cycling across Europe for 3 months, camping out in different places and seeing new sites and countries we'd never been to before. That was all pretty good. And then the year after, me and my 3 brothers all did Land's End to John O'Groats over about 10 days. That was really good fun. And the next year, once we got all the kit and the know-how, me and my younger brother, on maybe a day's notice, 2 days' notice, went and did a trip from London to Amsterdam. So we did that over 4 or 5 days. And then this all culminated in doing the world record trip myself in 2017 with a view to later doing a around the world trip. I wanted to try and do something that was solo and really challenging and really out of my comfort zone, and really see how far I can really push myself, and just trying to fit it in actually in a week with annual leave and limited budget.
You say that the previous trips have been quite leisurely, but I'm guessing your cycling style is probably a little bit faster, a little bit longer in terms of daily distances than most other people. What kind of bike do you ride? Is it a racing bike or is it a traditional touring bike?
It's just a road bike I bought. So it's aluminium, so it's maybe like 500-600 pounds. It's got little eyelets. You can stick a pannier rack on the back. But for the first 2 trips, it took far too much and ended up taking all this extra stuff that we kind of never used and just stayed at the bottom of our bags. And so doing this trip in 2017 to try and set a Guinness World Record was an opportunity actually to push it a bit further and do a lot more hours than I was used to. And when you're by yourself, there's a lot fewer variables. So in a group of me and my younger brother or me and my older brothers, you're always waiting for each other to get ready, or accommodations a bit more difficult to find because there are more of you or whatever. So actually doing a trip by myself, I could actually push it a bit further. I averaged for that trip 155 miles a day, which to some people sounds like a heck of a lot, but other people maybe in the endurance field doesn't sound crazy. I know you've had Mark Beaumont on your podcast, and he was doing 240 miles a day. So slightly different, but doing it by myself, 155, 160 miles a day was what I was aiming at. But actually, there are certain caveats with that, because the reason I haven't gone and done ultra endurance races is because a lot of it becomes who can sleep the least. And I was doing this trip in October because that was the only time I could get annual leave at the from the children's hospice I was working at the time. And so I could get a week annual leave then and fit this trip in just about. And October's not brilliant in terms of kind of long days. And so it was only getting light about 8 a.m. and it was getting dark by 6 or 7. And I really didn't want to push it into the night. For me, that adds an element of risk to it that I didn't particularly want to take. And so I was largely trying to get everything done between those hours. So I was doing about kind of 10 to 12 hours a day where possible. And then, so largely about 10 hours, and then maybe starting just before sunrise and finishing just after sunset. So about 10 to 12 hours, and then doing about 155, 160 miles a day. And then the last day, to try and get to my finish point in Bratislava in Slovakia, I pushed it to, I think, 13, 14 hours and did 200 miles that day.
That point you make about endurance cycling, if you read Emily Chappell's book, I don't know if you have, it's called Where There's a Will, was published earlier this year. That's certainly the impression you get. It is not just how far you can cycle, it's about just how little sleep you can get away with. So yeah, interesting point. Now, had anybody attempted what you attempted in 2017 beforehand? Did the record exist, or did you in effect invent it?
The record did exist. It was out there. I'd found it before. I think me and my younger brother were looking at things we could do for like a bucket list and things we would want to go out there and do. And after a few different trips we'd done previously, I kind of realized in my own mindset that I wanted to be someone who didn't just look at a lot of these trips or look at these kind of adventures people had on in films and movies and in their life and just look at it and say, yeah, I know I could do that. That's possible. And not actually go out and prove it to myself and show it to myself and actually live these adventures, but just watch them and kind of doff my cap and say, yeah, looks pretty cool. I bet I could do that if I tried, but I'm not going to. So I wanted to really go and live these adventures and really try them. And so the record did exist, and we looked it up and we realized that actually me and my younger brother coming up with a bucket list, setting a Guinness World Record would be quite good fun. And then it comes down to things like, okay, how long do I have I can get off work, and what kind of finances do I have, and that sort of thing. And then I quickly found this world record for the most countries visited by bike in a week. And some guy had done it before, a guy called Glenn, I believe, had cycled through about 11 countries in Eastern Europe. And then I'd planned in October of 2017 to go and do this trip when I could get some annual leave. And I'd found out actually the month before, I was in Rotterdam doing a triathlon. I was doing the age group world championships in Rotterdam. And I found out that two guys were actually doing the same record attempt a month before that I'd planned to do it. And I'd planned to do 13 countries. And this guy from the Netherlands, I forget his name now, he went and did 12 countries. And then another guy, a British guy, went and did 12 countries again, like the week after him. And so I was kind of sitting there, I'd been tracking their progress to see whether it was possible, what they were going to do, and whether my trip would then have to extend to 14 countries, or whether I was going to cancel my trip or whatever. And then decided that once they both done 12, I realized I could still go and do 13. And so, the month afterwards, set off at the end of my triathlon season, went off, and I wanted to just see what was possible for me, and went off to go and do it. What I didn't realize was how much evidence Guinness World Records really need. Stuff that Mark Beaumont doesn't tell you about how much evidence and everything you really need for that kind of thing. Because I had to do 2 minutes of video footage every single hour of the trip. I had to get witness statements statements of people I didn't know at the beginning and end of the trip, and then 2 signatures for every single country. And so you can imagine trying to find 2 people on a Sunday morning at 7 a.m. in Liechtenstein, or something like 8 a.m. in Liechtenstein, to try and sign your document and explain to them what you're doing and all the evidence you need to collect was a bit of a nightmare. So it was an interesting trip to do, but very, very different to the kind of more leisurely tours that I'd done before, when I was doing maybe 60, 70 miles a day and just kind of cruising about kind of in Europe and stopping at cafes and restaurants and that sort of thing.
It's a good way of meeting people along the way if you kind of have to ask them to sign your documents to prove where you are. But I seem to remember reading bits and pieces. Perhaps it was about you, perhaps it was one of those other guys who was attempting to do this record, because it does seem to ring a bell. They presumably went on a fairly similar route to you. There must be alternative ways of doing this. Did you consider anywhere else, or was it always going to be starting in the Netherlands, heading south, and then through into Eastern Europe?
There are other ways of doing it. So I think the original guy who's I think he maybe set up the record or whatever, because you can apply and ask Guinness World Records whether this is something you can go and do. He rode in Eastern Europe, so I think he rode from Poland south down towards kind of Greece way, whereas I had only really done most of my touring really in Western Europe. And so it was places I was familiar with on that kind of trip. And from my experience in touring, you kind of want to try and limit as many variables as possible and things you don't know, and limit the number of unknowns. And so what I tried to do was stick to countries that I'd been to before, and knew that the kind of cycling infrastructure was good, and they'd be more likely to be speaking English, because in Eastern Europe, kind of the further east you go, the fewer people speak English, and maybe the roads deteriorate slightly, and it's slightly harder to kind of navigate, that sort of thing. So in my mind, and with the prevailing wind that goes across Europe, it's generally, I think, southwesterly, kind of westerly wind. And so my aim was to kind of start in the west and head east was the idea. Yeah, so that was what I planned. I think one of the other guys had done was still sticky in Eastern Europe, kind of all through the Balkan states and that sort of thing, because all the borders are pretty close there. For me, I wanted to hit all the kind of the smaller kind of maybe the Alpine countries, because all the borders and things around there are quite close. So I started up in Maastricht in the Netherlands, and then quickly detoured into Belgium, and then into Luxembourg, France, across to Germany, and then into Switzerland and Liechtenstein, and then Austria, Italy, Slovenia, Croatia, Hungary, and then up to Bratislava in Slovakia for the finish line. About 1,070 miles, so that's 1,700 kilometers later in a week.
Was that the journey that you had planned to do, or were there any changes along the route where you thought, I'm going to go into this country instead of going, for example, after being in Slovenia, you could have headed south to Croatia and Serbia, but you headed back north. Were there any points where you actually did something different from what you'd planned?
On this trip, there wasn't, because I'd kind of looked at what other options there were heading south towards kind of Serbia and that way. And like I said before, these are countries that I hadn't actually been to before, and I wasn't sure how great the cycling infrastructure would be. I had thought originally about whether I'd planned a trip kind of going from Poland south, but then there was some debate over whether Guinness World Record would accept Kosovo as a country. I didn't want to get into that minefield and didn't really want to go and ride 1,000 miles in a week and then get home and Guinness World Records didn't accept the evidence or whatever. So I thought I would stick to countries that I definitely knew were countries and that definitely had acceptance, because Guinness World Records take 2 weeks to reply to every single message you want, and their evidence criteria is so complicated. And they're all very, very general, and it's very, very difficult to understand what exactly you need. Because on day 5, I had a bit of a nightmare, a mental blip really, and had a very difficult afternoon because I'd got an email from them that I'd sent off 2-3 weeks earlier in response to an email I sent 3 weeks earlier, saying that you needed a witness statement from every single person who was evidencing your kind of record rather than just signatures. I found that kind of very disheartening. I was in country number 9, I think, at that point, and 5 days in, and now they were telling me that I had missed 14 witness statements. And I said, well, what do I do with that? And so that was quite difficult. I decided to carry on, but with that in mind, when I got to Bratislava in Slovakia around 1 a.m., and I had about 8 hours before my final deadline, and with the Czech Republic, I think about 40 miles away, and then Poland about 110 miles away. So in theory, I could have got to 14 and 15. I decided that I wasn't sure about the evidence, and I'd come off my bike that day, and I'd cut open my hand after descending down this hill in Hungary, and a truck had dropped a whole bunch of sand and seed and things on a corner. So I just hit this and on kind of narrow racing tires and went across that and didn't stand a chance really, and just dropped the bike, ripped open my hand. Yeah, had a bit of a nightmare that day. That was one of the bigger problems. And so I got to Bratislava and decided actually it wasn't worth pushing on any further and risking it, because I wasn't sure I'd done the record evidence properly, and my hand was all sticking to the handlebars because of my hand kept bleeding. I looked so bad that I pulled up at someone's driveway, and a woman looked over a fence and kind of asked whether I was okay. And she said that she was a nurse, and said my hand looked very bad, invited me inside, and then sat me down and started tending to my hand. And it was only then that I realized that I was kind of gate crashing her 2-year-old's birthday party, and a whole bunch of little 2-year-olds were kind of like toddling around looking at me and wondering what was going on, and some random foreigner. She said, "Oh, are you staying close?" Because this was about 6 p.m. I said, "Are you staying close? Have you got anywhere to stay?" And I said, "Oh, I'm going to Bratislava," which was another 110 kilometers away or something. So she was quite shocked and very reluctant to let me carry on going. But I was at a deadline. But no, so that was the biggest problem I had really. But otherwise, I didn't detour too much off the plan, because for that kind of thing, it's very specific, and by the end of it, quite mentally tired. And so you don't want to start making decisions on the fly. It's kind of sticking to the plan and kind of trusting in what you prepared beforehand.
I was going to ask you actually why you didn't go to the Czech Republic, but that explains that quite well. Looking at the route that you have just talked through, there are some places. In fact, you did go to Croatia. I mentioned
Yes,
Croatia.
Yeah, I did dip in briefly. I was there for about 20 minutes. It was a great time.
In the example of Croatia, where you're just literally going there over the border to step on the territory of a new country, and then you have to start finding people to witness that you've been there. Did that cause delays? It's a bit easier if you're, say, cycling through Belgium or France, and you kind of just need to find somebody, and you can find somebody who looks like a reasonable person who will give you a witness statement, and hopefully, presumably, that they speak English. But if you're just going to Croatia for 20 minutes, was that a bit trickier?
It was indeed. And actually, the level of evidence you had to collect made the cycling seem so much easier. It was able to break it down hour by hour, because I had to film 2 minutes of every single hour. But then when I got to countries like Croatia, I was there for 20 minutes, and it was, I think, kind of 7:30 in the morning, 8 a.m., cruising through tiny little border town, absolutely no one there at all. And I dipped into some pub actually, and it seemed to be that there were 2 guys who'd been there from the night before, so were still pretty drunk and didn't speak much English at all, but were quite happy to sign their names and say that they'd seen me and kind of give their phone numbers and emails and kind of cheer me on in Croatian. I think they offered me a beer, but it was quite early in the morning and I still had a long way to ride. So I didn't accept, just said thank you, and then passed straight back over the border into Slovenia. But it was quite an interesting thing to try and do. And like Liechtenstein, very early in the morning, trying to find someone on a Sunday, and most of Europe on a Sunday is all closed. And so some hotel staff weren't very happy when I got the receptionist to sign my document, and then I proceeded to walk over to a table full of people kind of having breakfast, and I was kind of very focused. I was quite happy to walk over in my lycra and ask for some witness statements and some signatures. They weren't very happy. I think the worst one was in Constance in Germany, turning up, and it was it seems quite a young kind of town. It's quite a lot of young people in this bakery or this place I went to, and I was trying to get the kind of the people serving behind it, and there were two young, pretty attractive girls, and me turning up, hadn't showered properly, and all covered in dirt and grime, and in kind of one set of lycra I was going to wear the whole time, and then turning up and looking at my roughly translated through Google Translate from English to German what my kind of record criteria was and what I was asking them to do, them just kind of giggling at me and laughing at me as I was effectively asking them for their names and phone numbers to write down on this document. So I didn't feel particularly brilliant. Ended up being quite comical, talking to different people, and it does enforce you to engage and interact with some people, and you definitely meet some interesting folk doing that.
Yeah, I'll say. I hope you didn't tell the Guinness Records people that the two blokes who signed your forms in Croatia were drunk, because they might change their mind. Keep that one quiet. What were the highlights of the cycle?
I think, other than I love the Alpine countries, and some of the lakes in northern Italy and Austria are absolutely gorgeous. And some of the cycling roads in kind of Germany is brilliant for cycling. I love the mountains myself, and I really enjoy riding there. So from a cycling perspective, those were kind of brilliant places. Kind of northern Slovenia was brilliant, smooth roads and epic mountains. And it was such a very nice time of year because it wasn't too hot. But I think my overall highlight would be meeting the people. And I tried to tie in, because I needed all these signatures and statements and whatever, I tried to tie in accommodation with kind of meeting people through that way. And so I was using warm showers. I don't know whether how much you've used it or whatever, but it's kind of like couch surfing for cyclists. And so it was an opportunity to meet some people, and I'd never used it before. And my first couple that I stayed with in France, so I'd been through 5 countries that day. On the first day, done 155, 160 miles or something, and been 11 hours. And this couple were waiting for me, and I'd said, like, oh, is there a shop near you? I can buy food and buy myself dinner. They messaged me and said, oh, actually, don't worry about it. Well, is there anything you need to pick up? We can go and buy it for you. We've made dinner for you, so don't worry about it. And then they came out and found me, going to help me, kind of guide me to the house. And then they hadn't eaten dinner, and I'd arrived at maybe 8 o'clock, 8:30, so it was just after it was getting dark, and they still hadn't had food. And they said, oh, wait, you shower, go and take as much time as you need, and then you can come and have dinner with us, and then we'll stick around for breakfast, get up in the morning, get up really early, give you a great send-off. And they were such a lovely couple, and it was brilliant. And that was one of the highlights. And actually, despite the fact I was kind of against the clock and racing, I did spend a lot of time each evening with people, when I was able to find people to stay with, to sit there and chat. And it was very, very humbling to hear some of the people's stories. And they're not kind of on Instagram shouting about it and bragging about their trips or whatever. There's very kind of humble people living in northern France, doing all these really cool epic trips. They'd both cycled around France on a tandem, and I think they were bragging about the fact they'd hit 110 kilometers an hour on a tandem going down the Grand Colombier in France, doing a climb down there. And it was such an epic opportunity to actually listen to all these people and meet all these random people you never would do if you were on a regular holiday in a hotel, but actually being invited into someone's home through the kind of, I suppose, the vulnerability of being on a bicycle. People want to help you, and people want to help you out. And that's what I really loved about it. So that would probably be my highlights, actually, the people you met and some of the stories you heard.
Yeah, warm showers is fantastic. I've used it quite a bit over the years. I suppose the big advantage of warm showers over couch surfing is the fact that you automatically, when you turn up at that person's door, have something in common with them, i.e. the cycling, because it's just for cyclists and people who have done similar trips to you in the past. So yeah, I think that's the nicest aspect. And it is a fantastic way of meeting the people who live in the countries that you visit. If you were to do that particular trip again, perhaps to break your own world record, would you do it in the same way? Would you use the same accommodation? Would you go on the same route, but just push on into the Czech Republic and Poland?
Good question. I'm not sure. It was a brilliant trip, but I think probably the same thing after your trip. You're never the same person once you do the trip. It kind of opens up your mind to go and do something else. And so for me on that trip, I'd never ridden more than, I think, 120 miles in a day. Like, I'd done London to Paris via kind of Dieppe, so the kind of the shorter, cheating way to a degree. I'd done that in 24 hours. So that was my kind of biggest stint, had been Dieppe to Paris. It's been 125 miles, but I'd never ridden more than that. So for this to do then 150, 160 every day was a really massive challenge. And so pushing on from there, I think potentially you could get up to maybe 16 countries in a week or 70 countries without being silly. But I think a lot of these records now, people are going to take support teams and things like all the kind of ones north to south across Europe and that sort of thing. It changes it quite a lot because there's a lot less you have to think about and manage yourself. And that's part of the fun of it for me, is managing your own mental state and finding your own food and finding accommodation and trying to fix things on your bike. I would change if I was to do it again. I would definitely take a gear cable with me because mine broke in my first day in the Alps, about 100 miles short of Innsbruck. It snapped going up one of the climbs, and I'm not a brilliant mechanic, so I didn't want to start playing around with the limit screws to try and give myself a better range of gears. And so I ended up going over a kind of 15-20 minute pass, averaging a cadence of 27. And so my body was completely broken after that, just trying to chuck the bike around, trying to get it up and over this climb. And then I arrived in Innsbruck, I think, it was a Sunday evening. And because I was against the clock, everything was closed. And I didn't want to hang around in the morning till 10 a.m. for everything to open. So I had to do another pass and then stop at a bike shop in Italy to get it fixed the next day. So that was awful. So I would definitely bring gear cable. Routing-wise, you could push on to Czech Republic. You could push on to Poland, I think. So you could definitely get 15. I believe the record at the moment is 14. I think a guy from Poland went and did it last year. There was some rumours about someone doing 15, but I don't know whether that was ever confirmed by Guinness. So it's difficult. I think, not sure whether I would go and do it again. It gets to the point where you're just then compromising on sleep and safety. And so I get a lot of my competitive kind of edge and drive now in the kind of the triathlon stuff that I do, and then enjoy the touring and the kind of sightseeing, meeting people aspect of bike touring, really.
When I spoke to Mark Beaumont, one of the things that surprised me, because I always thought there was a difference between supported records and unsupported records, and he said there wasn't, and that Guinness World Records now don't differentiate between the two. And the reason why they do that is because it's really difficult to define what is supported and what's unsupported. So there is just one world record for going around the world, for example, and they don't differentiate between whether you're being followed by a van or whether you've got 4 panniers and you're just doing it with yourself. So it does get to the point where, why are you doing it? Are you doing it just to break the record, or are you doing it to actually have an experience? And there is a tipping point at some point, and it's managing to stay the right side of that tipping point in order to actually enjoy the experience.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's very much about, I think you've got to go in with the right plan and the right kind of idea of why you're going there. You want to push yourself and find your limit, but actually you don't want to compromise on things like safety. Like, it's not worth hitting country number 14, but like I was considering kind of riding on another few hours whilst absolutely shattered after the longest day I'd ever done on a bike, with a kind of a bleeding hand that was sticking to the handlebars. A whole bunch of mist was rolling in off the Alps, and potentially riding out of Bratislava, a place I'd never been to before, to try and then get to Czech Republic to get another country. And I was like, it's not worth it. There are certain things you've pushed yourself, you've achieved what you set out to do, you've broken the record. Don't get greedy with things. And I think that's quite an important lesson as well, to teach yourself that you kind of know why you're doing things and actually find it within yourself to be content with things. And actually, there's a degree of humility, saying, okay, right, this is where I've got to for now. I can sit back and kind of go over what I've done and see whether I can go further another time or go better, pick a better route or whatever. And I think that's a big mindset thing. I think from what I picked up and what things I've shifted through doing a few of these trips, is that I realized that actually I changed my definition of failure with these things, and actually failing on something and not making it to the destination or not breaking the record, not trying would have been the failure. Actually not reaching the destination, not making to country number 14, whatever, even though that wasn't on the plan, I actually got, okay, no, I achieved what I wanted to do. But actually it's a case of looking at it and saying, not trying is the failure. If you come up short of your target, then you've learned something. You can say, right, I can go back to the drawing board, look at the plan and say, okay, what can I do better next time? What can I improve upon? How can I improve my physical shape? How can I do it at a better time of year when there's more daylight hours? How could I save time trying to find some woman in a Hungarian bank to try and sign my documents? That wasted 20 minutes, half an hour, so you could improve time there. And so there's things you can do and things you can learn from. And so I think that's what I've learned through this sort of thing, is actually go in there and you know why within yourself to do it. And that then helps when you get back after the trip, kind of avoiding post-trip blues and things, because you realize I've done this trip to learn something and I've kind of achieved something. Now I can re-enroll that in my later life and whatever I'm doing going forward.
Yeah, I think I agree with most of what you've just said, although In this podcast, we're talking about premises for interesting cycle rides. And obviously, your premise for this cycle ride was trying to get to as many countries in 1 week, in 7 days. I suppose when what you've just said falls down a little bit is when you've set yourself the ambition of cycling point to point. For example, I know you've done Land's End to John O'Groats, and I've done point to point. Obviously, the last one I did, the big one from Tarifa in Spain to Nordkapp in Norway, I would have been mightily pissed off if I'd had to abandon that in northern Norway for some obscure reason. I don't know, perhaps my bike had gone kaput or I'd broken my arm or something. I would have been so hacked off. And I'm not sure whether I would have been able to mentally say to myself, oh, well, it was a good ride. I didn't quite get to Nordkapp, but, you know, what the heck, I can come back and do the whole thing again, perhaps next year. I'm not...
I think what I was trying to get at was actually not overreaching yourself to the point where it gets silly and dangerous, and actually realize what you set out to do. And in that sense, I set out to get to Bratislava, then to finish and get 13 countries. I had 8 hours before the deadline to get to country number 14 and potentially 15. But actually, it's a case of realizing where the limit is and realizing where things are getting silly. And I would agree as well. Like, had I not got to kind of John O'Groats or whatever from leaving the Land's End, that would have been frustrating. You have to be committed to the goal, and otherwise, as soon as it starts raining or you get a breath of a headwind, you're going to turn around. You've got to be careful with yourself. Your entire ego and your entire life and your entire identity doesn't get caught up in trying to be the most epic cyclist who's cycled across Europe on 1 hour's sleep kind of thing.
You did achieve the end of your ride. I mean, you could, I suppose in your case, on this ride, you had the option potentially of extending it, but actually you did get to that end. It wasn't a case of stopping short or anything like that. You had achieved and you had broken that world record when you arrived in Slovakia and in Bratislava. Just finally, this is a rhetorical question because I know the answer, but have you done any cycling since that trip, since that 2017 trip?
I have indeed, yes. So September 2018, I set off on a 349-day, 21,619-mile cycle around the world through 33 countries solo. Set off from my home, rode down to Lisbon, took a flight over to New York, and then did New York to Los Angeles, and then length of New Zealand, up the east coast of Australia, went Singapore up to Myanmar, and then basically started at the beginning of the Silk Road, and then headed west all the way to the Caspian Sea, and then kind of through Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, and then back across Europe to get home just before starting university term a couple of weeks after I got home last September. So yeah, I got back last August. So yeah, 11 months since I got back now. So that was what I got up to. And if anyone is interested in that, and any of your listeners are interested in that, all the highlights are on my Instagram page and all the photos of that. So I try to do a kind of a daily Instagram story and daily photos at David Heywood with 2 underscores afterwards, if you want to go and look at that. And that was the most humbling and most empowering experience in my life. And seeing people from all over the world wanting to support you and encourage you, and people who really kind of on the face of things really have nothing, offering you accommodation and food and places to sleep. And yeah, trying to do that on a very tight budget of around kind of 10, 12 US dollars a day was really interesting, and I loved it, and it was brilliant.
It must have been quite a liberating thing, not having to do all the stuff that you needed to do for the Guinness World Record. Must have been a relief, to say the least, after having done the trip the previous year.
100%. I couldn't agree more. Like, the Guinness World Record trip was brilliant to do it, and part of the challenge is trying to collate all the evidence and get things together and stay mentally switched on enough that you remember to do the filming and get the signatures. But actually giving myself a year to set off, just start pedaling. Big shout out to Spokes of Bagshot for hooking me up with a bike, and I was able to just effectively just start pedaling, but I had no real commitments. And so if I got bored, I would turn around. Friends of mine, I said I was off for a year cycling around the world, didn't really believe me. So I got to Los Angeles and I had a few friends saying like, oh, are you on the way home now? And I was like, you turning home now? I was like, no, I've done 4,000 or 5,000 miles. I've got another 16,000 to go or whatever. So it was brilliant, having no real agenda. I spent maybe 3 months just meandering around the States and just doing whatever. I did use different times to go a bit quicker, and there's still an element of competition in me. So I did one final day to see what kind of ultra touring was like, and I did a 317-mile day, just rode through the night from Geneva to Paris, to kind of give an idea of kind of what a Mark Beaumont sort of massive 240-mile day was like, or see what some of these ultra enduro races are like. And for me, I struggle with it. I was so tired rolling into Paris the next day, getting towards the end of the trip, and I did a 500k day, and I was absolutely dead. So big respect to anyone who can do that and do it safely. It's probably not for me. It was a brilliant trip, and I loved it.
Yeah, and you can find all the details about the various trips that you've gone on by visiting your website, which is www.david-haywood, that's Hay wood.com, and all the social media links are on that site as well. You're studying medicine, I know that, so clearly you've got the commitment of doing that for the next few years. Have you got any trips planned for the future?
Well, depending on what happens with the whole coronavirus pandemic and what goes on with that, the idea had been to do a tour around Ireland this summer, doing something a bit more local in a few weeks' time. So maybe by the time this has come out, me and my younger brother are going to try and kayak the length of the Thames River. I'm mainly getting into more triathlon stuff, and so over the next few years, whilst at university, going to try and see if I can, how close I can get to getting a professional license in that, and see whether I could compete in that. But there's a few different things. I recently saw someone do a trip north to south and back north again in Ireland. And whilst I'm over there for a little bit, I might give that a go, see what a few different things. And there's an element of being back out on the road and being kind of competitive again. That's starting to kind of tug on the heartstrings a little bit, and that's kind of getting me going and building a bit of fire inside me. So I may give that a go. But in the coming weeks, kayaking the Thames would be a bit of a micro adventure at home.
Okay, well, good luck with your future cycles, and thank you for talking to the podcast.
Appreciate being here. Thank you very much.
So what did you think of David?
Wow, hats off. To be able to push yourself and look for your personal boundaries is an amazing quality, and really interesting to hear of the mechanics of how that epic ride was put together. And something that interested me was this constraint from the Guinness Book of Records. Hello?
Can we have 2 more pints?
Yeah. I finish at 6. When you want to order your food, put your flag into the cup and Izzy will come across. Okay?
Thank you. See, we are really in a pub.
So yes, this constraint imposed on him by the Guinness Book of Records that he had to get signatures of people to prove he'd been in this country. Now, one of the rides that I did with my partner about 20 years ago, we went to all the places called Bath in the world and cycled in all of them, not necessarily between them. And we cycled around all Bath's twin towns in Europe. And my partner said, wouldn't it be a good idea to get a register, get a book, and find somebody in this village or this town called Bath, a teacher or an MP or whatever, and get them to sign the book. So that's what we did, and I still have the book with various MPs and teachers and bookshop owners and just people we met in the street, and a picture of them signing the book and their signature and a little message. And it has not only proved a really interesting souvenir, but the great thing for us was it made us engage with local people, and it forced us into finding somebody to talk to. And these often led to other adventures. We got invited to people's houses and talked to the MP of Barbados, Bath Barbados, and it worked out really interesting. We also met the Prime Minister of Nevis, Kitts Nevis, where there's a bath. So,
How many baths are there in the world?
Depends how you count them. There's loads in America. There's like 24 in America, but some are just a name on the map. Some are actual cities or towns. It was about 24 baths and the twin towns, and there was about half a dozen of them. So we cycled to all the twin towns, and we did some cycling in all the baths.
And did you include translations of the word bath as in a place where you wash yourself, as well as bath?
No, there would have been too many, because we would have had to go to Baden, or anywhere called Baños in Ecuador, and so on. One of the curious places was Bath in Scotland, which nobody had ever heard about, but it was this tiny village, the population 9, and I know because I met them all, and it's got a castle. And as a result, I was actually on Blue Peter. When they did a special live from Bath in 2001, I was interviewed about my Baths trip, and I have a Blue Peter badge to prove it.
I'm going to look on YouTube to see if you're there. I suppose that picking up on the signature thing, I mean, people do, when they do the Camino de Santiago or when they do pilgrim routes, they are used to picking up that kind of verification, that kind of evidence that they have actually done it. So it's nothing new, I suppose. It's something that's existed for a long time, but I suppose with the world record that he did, it was just a bit more stringent, and it must have. He talked about in the interview about how when he got to a certain place, he didn't realise that he had to get some certain kind of information, and it panicked a bit. He must have presumably got over that. Can you think of anywhere else in the world where doing that record might be possible on a bike, where you could visit 13, 14, 15 countries within 7 days? The kind of the European option is clearly one that lots of people go for because you've got lots of countries quite close together. Can you think of anywhere else where it might be possible?
In short, no. And I think it's down to history that in Europe you have this unusual situation in the world of states which eventually worked out some kind of collective nationhood and some which didn't. So in Europe you've got these strange outliers, places like Andorra or Liechtenstein or Kosovo, which may or may not be a country depending on what you think. But I don't think anywhere else in the world you get so many members of the UN in such a small geographical area. So any world record attempt, I think, will really have to be around. It'll involve Yugoslavia, or it might well involve places such as Monaco, Liechtenstein.
David was certainly, he's a driven individual, and he clearly saw the mental side of things just as important when it comes to that kind of long distance cycling as the physical side of things.
Yes, and I think it sounds a bit of a cliche, but cycle touring especially really can teach you a lot about yourself. And I know that I've been a lot better at sorting problems out since I did a lot of cycle touring, because we've all had it. It's raining and you lose your way and you get a puncture or some mechanical and you haven't anywhere to stay tonight, but you sort it out. And that kind of lesson to me was, if things start to go wrong quickly in anything that you're doing, some project at work or whatever, don't panic. I got through when I was doing Land's End John O'Groats or something, and that disastrous second day, I turned that round. Well, I can turn this situation around at work or in my personal life. So I think there really is a lot that we can all learn, a lot of lessons we can take from the experience of cycle touring, and it's clearly something that David has.
The other person I spoke to is James Briggs. Now, James, I think his attitude to cycle touring is very, very different, as you're about to hear. And he came up with the idea, well, I'll let him explain in a few seconds, but he came up with an idea that really I'd never heard of before. And again, I asked him to start off by just talking about himself and his background in cycling. So here's what he had to say.
I'm from the West Country originally, but I've been in London for about 10 years now. Cycling-wise, these days, I commute to work every day, and I go for a weekend ride every few weeks. Sometimes a long day ride, sometimes a shorter ride. So I guess I'm a casual cyclist, I'd say.
Had you done any cycle touring before the trip that we're going to talk about?
No, I hadn't done any at all, actually. It was always something in the back of my mind to do, but it always felt like one of those things that other people do, I think. The sort of Instagram is full of stories and pictures these days. And then there's books like your own book that you read. But it always seemed like a really romantic way to see the world, but I never thought it would actually be me that did it.
How did you first come up with the idea of cycling the route that we're going to talk about in a few minutes?
By happenstance, really. It was a bit of a lightning bolt one day. I was having a bit of a tough time of it at work, and I was feeling quite down, working lots of long hours. And David Bowie had just passed away a few months before. So I think he was in everyone's consciousness at the time. There was a lot of news stories about him. Everyone was hearing a lot of his music. And I was there on a Monday morning waiting to go to work, face another week. I think I just passed my bike in the hallway. I was singing Life on Mars in the shower, just sort of mumbling away, singing really terribly. And I spat out the words, see the mice in their million hordes from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads, which is one of the lyrics. And something just clicked at that moment. And it sort of connected in my brain, all these atoms firing around it. But I should cycle that for some reason. Yeah, it was kind of a bit of divine intervention from above, from Bowie, maybe. I don't know. But yeah, it just seemed like, yeah, why not? Bit of serendipity, cycle from one place to the other.
Most people, if they sing stuff in the shower, most of them, by the time they get out of the shower, let alone the following day or the following week, have probably forgotten all about it. What made you continue your thoughts, and what made you actually carry it through and cycle from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads?
I think because he was so prevalent at the time and in the news, it stayed with me. And there'd probably been something that I'd wanted to do this for a long time, but maybe I hadn't found quite the inspiration for the route I wanted to do. And this just seemed like a great way to do it. I didn't quite know what I was going to do, cycling from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads particularly. And then the more and more I thought about it, I sort of had a look at the route one day, just like, oh, I wonder how far it actually is. And I think on Google Maps, it came in at about 100 hours, which is something like, 4 days continuous cycling without any sleep. So you'd probably be able to do that in a week, I guess. But sort of being a fan of Bowie, and then as the idea kind of formed a lot more in my head, I was kind of thinking, well, like he lived in Berlin, he played in Moscow. I'm sure he'd played everywhere in Europe. I knew he'd recorded albums in different parts of Europe as well. So with the wonder of Google, I started to look things up, and I kind of ended up creating this thing. I called it like a star map, really. And it was all these random blobs around Europe where he'd played or he'd recorded, places he'd actually lived as well. Like he lived in Switzerland for 20 years, for example. And I think once you started to map it out, at some point, there's no turning back, really. It just gets harder and harder to not do.
What was the reaction of other people when you told them that you intended to cycle from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads based upon the lyric of David Bowie?
There were a few people who were just like, that's weird. A few people said, well, Bowie's weird. And then one or two people said, you're a bit weird as well. But there are other people who thought, oh, it sounds really fun. Like it sounds like quite an interesting thing to do. A bit daft, but an interesting thing to do. And then I think one of my friends said, yeah, but what are you going to do in, the hundreds of miles between two cities, for example, where he played? I'd already kind of mapped out the route by then. So, yeah, I was well on my way, really. But I think like that's kind of the attitude of Bowie anyway. He's don't care what other people think. If you want to do something, do it your own way. Go your own way, I guess.
So between the shower moment and you setting off, how long a period was that?
I think it was a couple of months or so. I was doing research along the way, and then obviously I was trying to think about how I'd do it on a bike, because at the time I had this beat up old racer, and I was a little bit naive about cycle touring. I didn't really know that you needed not necessarily you need one, but it's recommended you have a touring bike. So I'd gone into a bike shop one day and asked the guy behind the counter, I said, oh, can I have some, bags for this, so I can go off around Europe? And basically just laughed me out of the shop at the time. He said it will pretty much fall apart as soon as you put anything on it, that bike. So that was a rude awakening. So fortunately, I was on the Cycle to Work scheme. It was kind of a reasonably affordable way to do it, because you can pay it off over up to 18 months, I think. So I wasn't having to pay back too much straight away, but obviously I had the bike straight away. Yeah, and then it was kind of like, do I do some training beforehand? And I was again a little bit naive about that. I sort of cycled up a few big hills once or twice, and I cycled out to a few Bowie landmarks actually in London, or just outside of London, because he lived around the areas of Bromley and Brixton. And he'd actually recorded Life on Mars and a bandstand in Beckenham as well. So it felt like the right place to start the trip and get in a little bit of training as well.
So when did you set off? What year are we talking here?
It was 2016, actually. So it was the year he passed away. He was coming on for, when did I leave? In September that year. So the weather was just starting to turn at that point. But that was sort of the only time I could get off work, because I ended up taking all my annual leave in one go, and then a couple of weeks of unpaid leave as well. So I would have liked to have gone in the summer ideally, but it ended up being more autumn time.
This is all very reminiscent of when I set off on my first ride when I cycled to southern Italy, because I set off on a bike that I bought via the Cycle to Work scheme. I'd never done any cycle touring, any overnight cycle touring, and I was a novice to say the very least. And also, I hadn't really trained that much. So this is all very reminiscent of what I experienced back in 2010. So you presumably you flew down to Ibiza in that September of 2016 and started cycling.
Yeah, I cycled to City Airport in London, and I didn't really know what I was doing. I hadn't bought a bike box for my bike, so I'd found a £10 plastic bag on Amazon that was a giant bag basically, and took the pedals off. And there was some really kind airport staff who laughed at me, but then managed to let me get it on the plane anyway. Unfortunately, it turned up in one piece at the other end, but yeah, so it was going from something like 15 degrees in England, landing in Ibiza where they're having a bit of a renaissance of a summer. And I think it was about 35 degrees when I touched down, and was kind of at a bit of a loss what to do in Ibiza. I hadn't actually found anything David Bowie related there. So I decided to go to the hippie area of Ibiza, stay away from sort of like the club area, and try and channel his inner hippie phase as a starting point for the trip.
That's an interesting point. So although he mentions it in his lyric, there is, as far as you know, no connection between David Bowie and Ibiza.
That was kind of like the part of the thing that, I don't know, was one of the reasons for the trip. It was like the lyrics in the song Life on Mars are very, very surreal. And people have pored over them for years and years, like trying to find their own meaning within them and trying to find any sense of what these lyrics mean. Because things like Mickey Mouse has grown up a cow, sailors fighting on the dance floor, things like that. And someone had made up the theory that Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads is following the mice in their million hordes. And it's talking about mass tourism. And that was someone's theory about that. So I guess that makes me a mass tourist in that case if I ended up doing that route. But
yeah, and also I suppose if there is a mass tourism connection, then Ibiza fits in with that because it's a popular holiday destination, obviously. So yeah, perhaps. I would imagine the first thing you had to do after you'd been to the hippie place on Ibiza was jump on a ferry back to the mainland, yeah?
Yeah, that's right, yeah. So I was looking to obviously find my way to the Norfolk Broads by hook or by crook, or zigzagging across Europe. So I cycled back to the ferry port in Ibiza, and there's a ferry you can take to Barcelona. I think it was about 4 hours, and it's a really, really calm crossing actually, and it's super cheap with a bike. And I think when I got on there, I actually got upgraded to a cabin, which was nice as well, because it gave me a chance to kind of figure out what I was doing with my bike bags and try and pack things in some kind of order. But that was one of the nice parts of the trip, actually. When you get to the other end, you don't have to wait to queue up for your car or anything like that. You can literally get on your bike and roll down the ramp, and you're into the city within 10 minutes. So it's quite an exhilarating sort of start to maybe the proper cycling part of the trip.
Right, so I've got your map in front of me. If anybody wants to see your map, incidentally, you can see it on your Instagram page, which is at Bowie_by_bicycle, and there's a picture of your map there. So you head off, well, in a northerly direction into France, towards Switzerland, Paris. Can you talk about that first leg between Barcelona and Paris?
So it was the weather was really nice at that point. I think I got a bit of a false sense of what it was going to be like for the whole trip. I cycled along the coast from Barcelona up to Figueres, where the Salvador Dali Museum was, and tried to find some meaning in the surreal museum there to the Bowie lyrics. Apparently they shared a lover throughout the years. And then it became quite hilly. It's basically I had to cross the Pyrenees at La Pertus. Was quite unprepared for that, but I think it was about 1,300 meter climb, which is slow and steady. And I was overtaken by an old man on a bicycle, which I later worked out was an electric bike. But yeah, it was kind of trying to find these places of Bowie interest along the way. So the Dali Museum was one of the first ones, the sort of surrealism of Bowie's lyrics. And then I got into France and was going to places like Nîmes, which is where he played a show on Bastille Day, and started heading up north towards Switzerland. But there was quite a few sort of surprising little moments along the way. Like I think it wasn't just, I was expecting it more to be like, oh, it's going to be 300 miles till I hear something about Bowie next. But people are often stopping you and asking you what you're doing, and I didn't really see any reason to lie about it. So I'd often end up chatting to them about David Bowie, and if they didn't know him, I'd play him a song, and they'd be pretending they were interested in the story. And then sometimes you get a bit of good fortune along the way. I think I sat down really tired one day, and I'd run out of water in the middle of nowhere in France. And I saw on the map there was this place called Saint-Pierre-le-Roc. By coincidence or David Bowie fate, Pierre Laroque was actually the guy who invented the lightning bolt insignia, which is probably the thing, I think, the bit of iconography everyone associates most with Bowie himself. It's on the front of the Aladdin Sane album cover. So I thought in my great wisdom, I'd cycle up the Ardèche Mountains, which was 13 kilometers uphill, to see if there's any truth or trace in this being Bowie's famous makeup man. And of course, there wasn't at all. So yeah, it was a very thirsty, dehydrated day after that. But it was a really nice moment along the way, you know, just this bit of serendipity. And as I moved up towards Switzerland, where he basically lived for 20 years.
And in Switzerland, you visited the place where he got married. Was it in Lausanne?
Yes, it was in Lausanne Town Hall. So he lived around that area for quite a long time in these big houses at the top of very big hills. So there was a lot of hill cycling at that time. And he got married to Iman in the town hall in Lausanne at the time. And I kind of cheated my way in, shall I say, to the town hall. I said I was doing research for a document, and would they mind if I looked at the wedding room? And a little man who's quite Napoleon-esque, actually, he refused me entry at first. And then I explained what I was doing to the woman on reception, and she demanded to the man that I be let in to look at the room. So yeah, that was quite nice. And there was lots of other things around there. It's a really beautiful place to cycle around Lake Geneva. At the end, there's a place called Montreux on the northern side of the lake, where Queen had a recording studio, and that was where Bowie and Queen recorded Under Pressure together. It was meant to be after this crazy night of a whirlwind of alcohol and drugs, and somehow they knocked out this, you know, world famous, enduring classic at the same time. That was the rock and roll legend anyway.
So you got to Paris. Now, in Paris, looking at your map, it looks as though you took a flight to, is it Moscow? And then headed west from Moscow back in the direction of Berlin and eventually the Norfolk Broads. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the route I took. I actually took a train from Paris to Moscow, and then from Moscow back to Berlin. It's this really fantastic train, actually. It's very modern, and I think it's part of the old Trans-Europe Express, which is sort of famous in Kraftwerk, a Kraftwerk song which name checks like Bowie and Iggy Pop. But yeah, it's like 3 days, 2 nights, the train, and I was sort of packed on with my bike, which I wasn't sure whether you were allowed to take on at all or not. So it caused quite a stir when I came on with this bike, and it was in like a tiny little cabin where 4 people were meant to be sleeping. On the way back, 2 women came on and just started shouting at me. They said, "Niet, niet, niet," which is no, 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 and pointing at the bike. So I was like, oh my God, I'm going to be stuck in Moscow here with my bike, and how am I going to get it back to Western Europe again? The security guards came on the train, and they were sort of like trying to figure out what the problem was, but they could only speak German, and I only speak very basic German. So it was quite the situation, and I was trying to calm it down by playing them David Bowie songs, which was a bit silly. But yeah, we ended up, after having to spend 2 or 3 days together, they ended up being absolutely lovely. One was like an ex-Soviet ballerina, and we were trying to communicate through music on our phones, and she ended up playing me quite a lot of Chris Rea songs for some reason. But yeah, it was quite a nice musical exchange along the way.
What's the Moscow connection with David Bowie?
He visited there a couple of times. He apparently had a fear of flying, so he'd taken the Trans-Siberian Express all the way back from Japan across Europe. So he'd stopped off in Moscow at one point, and I think he'd got quite a lot of inspiration from the sort of communist Soviet era, and it kind of informed some of his albums. So things like Diamond Dog. Diamond Dogs is a lot about dystopian life, and it was Bowie's take on being in Moscow. He eventually came back there and played a concert in the Kremlin Palace. So but I think he said it was one of his worst ever concerts because the crowd was so cold to him. They didn't really applaud him or anything like that. So yeah, I think he went a couple of times with mixed results, but he vowed never to play there again after that, and I don't think he ever did.
How did you find cycling from Moscow back to Berlin? What was that like?
So I did actually take that on the train. That was the return train leg. So I think we passed through Belarus and Poland on the way back. So there's another connection with a Bowie song there. He's got a song called Warsaw, which is Warsaw. I'm not sure I pronounced it correctly. That's another sort of famous song. And he was rumoured to have stepped off this train onto the Warsaw train platform and walked into the city centre and bought a record of a Balkan boys choir. And that apparently inspired some of the sounds on the album, which is all kind of like unusual chanting in an invented language. So there were all these little connections on the way back to Berlin. So,
what was the reason why you took the train? Why didn't you cycle from Moscow to Berlin?
I think it was purely a time thing because I had a limited time frame to do it, and there was a lot of gaps as well in between sort of Germany and Moscow. I think it's a many thousand miles, I think. So I think, although I might have bumped into a few people who had or hadn't heard of him, it would have just taken me too long. And I don't think there would have been any sort of Bowie connections there as such. His music was actually banned in Russia at the time as well. So I don't know. I think the more modern people would have heard of him, but less so much the Soviet era.
So you arrive in Berlin. Now, the connection between Bowie and Berlin is quite strong, isn't it? He spent quite a few years living there. And from what I understand, he was trying to win himself off drugs at the time. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So he'd had a phase in the 70s where he pretty much kind of almost killed himself. He was this skeletal man who was living in Los Angeles at the time, and he had like cocaine psychosis and was seeing things in the bottom of swimming pools and thinking witches were falling from windows outside his hotel room. So he was in quite a bad place. And I think he'd heard from, the rock and roll scene that Berlin was kind of this interesting place at the moment with the wall being up there and the situation that was going on with the communists and the Western world. And it was kind of very edgy for artists at the time. So I think he kind of made a decision to go there and live liberally and get inspiration from, he always sought inspiration from unusual situations. And I guess, and he kind of went there to get clean, apparently. But I think it was actually the drugs capital of Europe at that point. So I don't know if that was an honest intention or not. But he basically moved there with Iggy Pop, who was in the same situation as him. They got an apartment together in Berlin, and they wrote, they painted, they made music together. I think there's a famous thing, it's known as his Berlin Trilogy album set, the Triptych it's called in German. And he recorded a couple of those albums there. He didn't actually record them all there, but he did a few of them there. And I think a lot of the inspiration came from living in Berlin at the time.
It probably was a hotbed of drugs, I would have thought, in the 1970s when he was there. But also, if you want to wean yourself off drugs, do you go and live with Iggy Pop? I mean, that's probably not the best decision ever.
No, I think there's quite a few crazy stories of them coming out, getting into a few scrapes and sort of hell-raising experiences. Iggy Pop was sort of found outside a restaurant writhing naked in snow, and Bowie and Iggy Pop were driving around a car park at 80 miles an hour off their heads on cocaine. And he wrote a song about it called Always Crashing in the Same Car, but I don't think he did crash because it ran out of petrol, and apparently they just burst out laughing. But I guess when you rock and roll, you can get away with those kind of things.
You called your bike Iggy?
I did, yeah. It seemed sort of fitting at the time, like to have a sidekick or a companion who hung around with Bowie. I don't know if my bike was as much of a hellraiser or a bad influence or not. He was a very faithful companion, though. So, yeah, it seemed like a fitting name.
Right, so you're in Berlin and you're now kind of not that far from the Norfolk Broads. Tell us about that final section from Berlin to the Norfolk Broads.
I think it was coming into October at that point, and Berlin had been fantastic for the going to learn about Bowie and finding places where he'd recorded songs. Like I went to the Hansa studios where he recorded Heroes. There was a lot of museums and art galleries that had inspired him there. There was a bridge that was apparently, when the Berlin Wall fell, he wrote about in a song called Where Are We Now later on, called Boastbrücke. So that was like a real gold mine of Bowie stuff. And then leaving Berlin after that, it's a long, long way back because it's quite far east in Germany. And the weather had decided it was very much going to be autumnal, and the temperature was dropping quite rapidly. It was rainy. This is where there were big, long stretches where the Bowie stuff was a little bit more thin on the ground, and there was so many different directions you could take to try and seek that out. Do you go north? Do you go south? So I ended up going quite far west to Cologne and Dusseldorf and places like that, which is a long old way from Berlin, and just sort of wild camping along the way and trying to stay out of the rain, basically. Yeah, when I got to Cologne and Dusseldorf and those kind of areas, this was a big sort of like influence on Bowie's music. It was called krautrock in England, and it was this kind of new sound of music coming out of Germany at the time, which actually really went on to be influential for a lot of English musicians. So it was bands like Kraftwerk had a studio in Dusseldorf, and there was Can and Neu. And I ended up cycling down to Cologne to find this old recording studio, which was supposedly the home of krautrock. And there was this producer called Conny Plank who'd lived there. And he was quite an interesting guy. He was sort of like would only ever work with interesting artists. So apparently he'd sort of turned down U2 because he didn't like Bono at all. He absolutely hated him. I think he also refused to work with David Bowie, or his wife had said don't work with him because of his drug problem. So it was, quite an out there part of the trip. And I sort of befell a few incidents along the way. I lost my phone at that point. Yeah, the weather was getting very cold. I think I'd rolled my bike through some human excrement at one point as well. It was starting to get that point where I was going a little bit crazy myself.
On the topic of accommodation, you mentioned wild camping there. Is that what you'd done since leaving Ibiza?
I'd always planned to camp where possible. And because of the sort of like random nature of the route, it wasn't necessarily always along. I know there's things like Eurovelo, which have, the campsites marked out along them. But I often found myself in places where there was just nowhere to stay. I was in the middle of nowhere. So I'd have to sort of end up huddling behind some trees or trying to sort of shield myself away from the roads and just popping up the tent. But it tended to get dark quite early because it was winter time. So I'd be sort of sat in my tent at 6:30 at night, wondering if anyone was going to come and kick me out of the field or find me. So there was a portion of the trip that was like that, just sort of getting to the point where it's dark and trying to get off the road and find somewhere to sleep. A few times there was, campsites aplenty in places like Holland. And they were really welcome sometimes, after a long day of cycling when you just want a cold beer and a hot shower. That's always something to look forward to at the end of the day. But yeah, a few times when I was in cities, I stayed in hostels in Berlin and Moscow. And then I had one night in a hotel in Paris to treat myself as well. So it was a bit of a mix, really.
The guy you were talking about a few minutes ago, was his name Conny?
Conny Plank, yeah.
Had he met David Bowie?
So, yeah, I think there's a bit of a myth around the whole story. Apparently, he was the only man or one of the only men to refuse to work with David Bowie. So he'd wanted this very famous German producer to work on his Germany-inspired records, basically. Bowie had supposedly gone to his farmhouse, which was 30 miles outside of Cologne, and kind of, tried to get him to work with him. But for one reason or another, the story I got told was that Conny Plank's wife wasn't too keen on having this disheveled, potentially raucous rock and roll drug user around the farm at the time. So he theoretically didn't get to work with him directly. But Bowie was also working with a producer at the time called Brian Eno. And he ended up working with Conny Plank himself. And I think he learned a lot of production skills from working with this guy, Conny Plank, and ended up transferring them onto Bowie's Berlin trilogy, which is why he's borrowed or been influenced by this sound that he wanted to get on the records, and which comes through quite strongly in those artistic and groundbreaking records that he made in the late 70s.
I think I might have misunderstood this. Did you meet Connie Plank or not?
He'd actually passed away, so I'd gone to see where the studio was. So he died of cancer, I think, probably about 10 years ago now, maybe 8 or 9 before I took the trip. But I wanted to see if the studio was still there where this quite revolutionary music was coming from at the time. But I got to this tiny little village, 30 kilometers outside of Cologne, and there was nothing there apart from cows chewing grass, basically. Yeah, I think it had been bulldozed a long time ago, the studio, unfortunately. I tried to ask a few locals, but yeah, it didn't seem to be there anymore.
Did you meet anybody from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads via Paris, Moscow, Berlin, etc.? Did you meet anybody and speak to anybody who had actually met or knew David Bowie when he was in those particular places?
No, I tried to along the way. I'd got sort of in contact with people at some of the studios, and I'd been into one outside of Paris. It was a place called the Honky Chateau, and a lot of famous artists recorded there, like Pink Floyd, Fleetwood Mac, like the Grateful Dead, and Elton John had an album named after it as well. And I got into there. I actually told them I was a BBC travel journalist, which was a small white lie. And when I got there, the mayor of the village had turned up to meet me as well. But somehow, yeah, by hook or crook, I managed to get myself inside and got a tour of the studio where he recorded the album Low, which is kind of one of his most sort of celebrated in creative terms. And the original piano that they recorded all the famous bands I just mentioned was still there. The guy who owns the studio now started to play it, and it was just the most amazing sound. It was a really emotional moment, thinking that like Bowie had played that piano, and it just sounded incredible in the studio as well. And he was a very good piano player as well. And I think I might have shed a little tear at that point, but I tried to hide it. But yeah, that was kind of one of the closest I got. And sorry, to answer your question a little more directly, I guess, I'd actually tried to meet Rick Wakeman, who was the pianist on Life on Mars. So it's a really beautiful bit of playing. And Rick Wakeman was a classical pianist, so it'd always be fantastic. And he actually lived towards the end of the trip. He lived not too far from Norfolk. I think he lived in Suffolk at the time. So I had the brainwave that I'd knock on his door and try and explain this stupid trip to him, or this crazy trip to him. And that was kind of going to be one of the, maybe a fitting end to the trip. But when I got near his house, it was very sort of stalkerish. I almost chickened out a bit, and I looked up online to see if there's any information about what he'd been doing recently. And he was actually away on a world tour at the time with his band called Yes, who'd been in for many years. So I thought along that way there was, I wasn't going to quite meet someone who'd played with him or anything like that. And actually, after I got home, I'd come back, and I think it was only about a month later, and I was on the tube in London, just stood on the escalator, and I looked behind me, and Rick Wakeman was actually on the escalator behind me. So I'm not an overly confident guy. I wouldn't just bowl up to him and start, a conversation, but I felt like it was too much of a coincidence not to say something to him. So I let him walk past me when he got out of the tube station, and I said, I've got to say something to him at least. And poor Rick, obviously. And I caught up with him eventually, and I said, "Excuse me, are you Rick Wakeman?" Obviously knowing he was Rick Wakeman, and he was very patient and kind, and he said, "Yes, I am." And I said, "Oh, this is a bit crazy, but I did this trip around a David Bowie lyric, and obviously you played on the song, and I just wanted to say thank you, and I wished him a Merry Christmas." And he was lovely. He was off to the BBC to record some Bowie covers, I think, actually, for the Simon Mayo show. But yeah, it felt like a really nice ending to the trip, having met someone and shook someone's hand, the guy who played piano on Life on Mars.
So you did meet somebody who had actually known David Bowie?
Yeah, it was a month after the trip had finished, so I cycled all that way to not meet anyone until after I got back to London in the end, which I probably should have known. But yeah, it was a really nice ending to the trip. And obviously he's such a big part of that song. The piano, drives a lot of the song, and I think it's quite a famous part of it.
The obvious question now is, you've done one lyric from David Bowie. You must have, in the last 3 or 4 years, you must have sung in the shower more lyrics from David Bowie, from other people perhaps. Have you come up with any more ideas as to more cycles that you can do in the future?
Oh God. Yeah, I guess there could be a few. He had an album called Station to Station. I guess you could do one around that, pick two train stations on opposite sides of a continent or the world and do it that way. That's another famous sort of 70s album. What are the songs with lyrics? I think New York and London have sort of got some of the songs most named after them, New York and London. But there's a Beach Boys song called Kokomo, which lists a lot of Caribbean places, which will probably be a bit warmer to do, more interesting. I think it's Aruba, Jamaica. Oh, I want to take you to Bermuda, Bahama.
Have you done any cycle touring since you finished that trip?
I haven't actually. I planned to do another trip a couple of summers ago. I ended up getting stuck into writing a book about this trip. But I planned to go to Denmark and sort of cycle around. I think there's a headland where you can cycle around. You can wild camp or free camp all the way around. And you can take a ferry from Harwich to a place called Esbjerg, I think it is. And when we were young, we took a family holiday there. But yeah, that was kind of an idea one summer. And then as it started to gather momentum, like the Bowie trip did, I looked up the ferry, to try and do some logistical plans. And the ferry had stopped running about 10 years ago. So that kind of kiboshed that one pretty quickly. But I do want to do it again, yeah. And I don't know if maybe I need more inspiration to find a route, or I should just cycle point to point, make it a bit easier on myself.
Keep singing lyrics until you stumble upon something that you could emulate on your bike.
Yeah, exactly.
You mentioned the book. Is that going to be published? Is that going to be self-published? What's the story with the book?
I'm trying to figure it out. So I've finished it now. It's all done. It's kind of, as I guess I've talked about quite a lot, it's a lot about Bowie history and obviously the travelogue element of the trip. And just sort of thinking that anybody can get out there and do something like this, whether it's you just need a bit of inspiration, whether that's a picture of a beautiful place or a song lyric. But yeah, the book's written, so it's trying to figure out what to do next with it. Yeah, I'd love to get it published one day, and I don't know whether that would be self-published or traditional. Need to look into those options.
Nowadays, in terms of travel writing, and certainly probably in terms of cycle travel writing, it helps if you've got some kind of twist to what you did. And certainly your journey from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads, you could even call the book From Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads. Have you given it a name?
Yeah, that's the working title at the moment, From Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads. I think I had a Bowie Bike Oddity as the second part of it, but yeah, it's the working title at the moment. I guess it makes the most sense. And hopefully I think a few people would know that lyric. If not, the song is incredibly famous.
I think that's a fascinating tale. And I think it's an excellent way of coming up with a interesting, innovative, different way of deciding where to go on a cycle trip. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's been great chatting about it.
So that was James, who cycled because of the David Bowie lyric, From Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads, from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads, albeit via Moscow, Berlin and various other places. Now his attitude to cycling, his attitude to travelling, I think is clearly very, very different from the one that we heard earlier with David.
Yes, and whereas David clearly gets a kick out of giving himself constraints and then seeing how he reacts to those constraints and almost being competitive with himself, James just wanted the experience and was happy to sort of make up the rules and change things as he went along. And that's, I suppose, more my kind of touring. Starting with this crazy idea, Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads. Well, actually, how would that work out in practice? Well, I'll fly over to Ibiza and find out. And then he has to get this ferry. And then he takes a train to Moscow and to Berlin. And I love that kind of spontaneity. And I think that's more my kind of riding. And it's what inspires me about riding, is being able to change your plans and to react to the circumstances and to think, what is it actually in the end that I want out of this? I don't particularly want to just fulfill the task. I want to have an experience and a unique experience. And clearly that's what James got, and it sounded great fun.
Can you think of any other lyrics that might inspire cycle touring journeys? We talked in the interview about Simon and Garfunkel, because they come up with lots of places, well, for example, the song America, but they tend to talk about lots of different places they've visited. How about the Beatles? Could cycle down Penny Lane, I suppose, but that wouldn't get you very far.
Yes, and of course a lot of the lyrics in America are based on what actually happened when Paul Simon was going out with this English girl called Kathy Kitty, who is the Kathy of Kathy's song and who he's thinking about in Homeward Bound. So there could well be a kind of Simon and Garfunkel songbook trail that you could put together. Certainly some of the rides I've done have been a bit like James, that I've started out with some completely arbitrary premise. One of them was rhyming rides. I just started out one day, I was talking with some of my friends, we'd done Land's End John O'Groats, and we were thinking, what else could we do, especially a side-to-side? Is there some kind of westernmost to easternmost point? And somebody suggested Barmouth to Yarmouth. So Barmouth in Wales to Great Yarmouth. And we thought, this is a great idea. So I ended up doing it by myself, Barmouth to Yarmouth. And then I thought, what else can you do that rhymes? So it's got to be a coast to coast. You can't just do York to Cork or something like that. So I did Barrow to Jarrow, and Lynmouth to Teignmouth, and Poole to Goole. And they were all great. And there was something about this arbitrary nature, very much like with James's trip, that as I went along, I just had these experiences and people that I met and places that I went en route, from starting with this totally arbitrary two endpoints and just seeing, well, if I make up the rules as I go along and make up the route as I go along, what's going to happen?
Perhaps that's what Sustrans should do. They should, rather than making logical decisions based upon evidence of where people want to cycle, perhaps they should do Goole to Poole and
Yes, Lynmouth to Teignmouth.
Lynmouth to Teignmouth. But I think that's a brilliant idea.
Yes, and they all turned into great rides, precisely because I didn't know what was going to happen. There was nothing like it. There was no clue as to what it was going to be like. But in a place like Britain, as we know, a place that's so full of varied scenery and history and stories and people, you can go between pretty much any two places and you're going to probably have a good time.
I think tomorrow, when I continue my journey, because tomorrow you're heading back to York and I'm heading off in the direction of the Lake District, I'm going to pass through every single place that I pass through and trying to think of somewhere which rhymes with it. So as to Kendal, for example, I've got to pass through Kendal. What rhymes with Kendal?
Pendle to Kendal. They're not on the coast, but actually that would be quite a nice ride, Pendle to Kendal.
Well, it's not very far. Pendle to Kendal, is it?
It's not, but you could get in maybe the Forest of Bowland and some of the Howgills. So yeah, you could put together quite a nice route there.
My destination tomorrow is... Where is my destination? I've forgotten. Ambleside. I'll say it again. My destination tomorrow is Ambleside. Can you think of anything that rhymes with Ambleside which doesn't repeat the word side?
In a word, no. I went through a phase last year of trying to find rhyming couplets abroad, and I just couldn't find anywhere. I pored over the map of Spain for hours and hours trying to find two places that rhymed. Apart from Valencia and Palencia, I couldn't actually find anywhere. And I wonder if Britain is better on rhyming place names than anywhere else. But if anybody can come up with some rhyming place names in Poland or Italy or wherever, I'd be really interested to find out.
I'm just trying to think of all the capitals of Europe now and trying to think of something that rhymes with them. Rome, Paris, Berlin.
Yeah, Rome. Well, unfortunately, Frome is pronounced Froome, not Frome, even though it looks like it ought to rhyme. Paris to Harris, how about that?
That would be a good ride. Paris to Harris, yeah.
Yeah. Another set of rides I've got planned for the future is places in Britain that sound like they're somewhere else. So near, or in Lincolnshire, there's a village called New York and a village called Boston, a town called Boston rather, and you can cycle from New York to Boston, and they're only about 15 miles apart. So it got me thinking, where else sounds like somewhere foreign? And there's all sorts of places like Gibraltar and Egypt and Holland and Moscow and Florence. So you could cycle from Moscow to Florence, staying in Britain. So that would be another set of rides. That
Chapel Le Frith.
Chapel en Le Frith, exactly. There's one in Germany, yes, and the one in England, of course.
And there's that place.
There isn't one in Germany. I was making that up, just in case anybody's listening.
There's that place just south of Ilkley called... The train passes through it. And it... No, just south of Ilkley, on the train line back down to Bradford, you pass through a place which I always think sounds Welsh.
Benridding.
Benridding, that's right. And in fact, in the Lake District, you've also got Glenridding, which to me doesn't sound at all like a Lake District place.
That sounds like it should be in Scotland, doesn't it? Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so yes, geographical dislocation. There's a whole book full of rides there.
Well, I think you've just managed to kind of get me thinking about many, many rides that I could do in the future. So I take my hat off to you for your inventiveness in terms of coming up with reasons to go from place A to place B, but kind of in a way which is far more interesting than calling them simply place A to place B.
Well, I'm pleased that I've had that effect. That's great. Yeah, and as I say, the great thing for me is these arbitrary ideas actually turn out to be great adventures and great fun.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more, so thank you.
Thanks very much. We're going to have another pint.
The background noise in the pub was courtesy of the locals making the most of the easing of lockdown. The background noise here at Rydal Hall, near Ambleside, is courtesy of the raging torrent of water that passes through the grounds of the estate. The morning after our visit to the pub, Rob headed back to York on the train, and I continued my very indirect journey to Edinburgh by cycling west along Dentdale to Sedbergh, up and down over the seemingly endless hills on either side of the M6 motorway to Kendal, and then finally towards Lake Windermere and Ambleside, where I arrived on Thursday evening. I've been trying to pick out routes of the National Cycle Network using OpenStreetMap to create a bespoke jigsaw of a journey, and so far it's working well, keeping me well away from most busy traffic. Rydal Hall is a great place to camp, by the way. I first came here back in 2017 when I walked up the neighbouring fell called Red Scree. The hall itself was built by the Le Fleming family in the 16th century and altered and enlarged in the 17th and 18th centuries. It's now owned by the Church of England, run as a retreat for the clergy, but there's an extensive, well-equipped campsite for the likes of me and you. The setting is spectacular and it's certainly recommended. Yesterday I met up with a local cycling contact and he guided me on a circular tour taking in the Greater Langdale Valley and Little Langdale, then south to Coniston before a return to Windermere via Hawkshead and Sorey, once home to Beatrix Potter. It was a very, very wet ride indeed. But weather-wise, things are looking up. Tomorrow I'm back on the road heading to Edinburgh, and the whole journey from West Yorkshire to Scotland will probably be the subject of the next episode of the Cycling Europe podcast. But who knows? With no podcast master plan, anything could happen. This has been episode 23 of the Cycling Europe podcast. Thanks to Rob Ainsley, David Heywood and James Briggs for taking part. And thank you to you for listening. If you'd like to get in touch, it's podcast@cyclingeurope.org. Stay safe and happy cycling.